Welcome to the Veritas Forum, engaging university students and faculty in discussions about life's hardest questions and the relevance of Jesus Christ to all of life.
Whenever I get introduced, it's always a bit awkward for me because you hear all these people say flattering things about you and you sort of sit in your seat and you squirm a little bit. And I remember I was once introduced as the most insightful mind of his generation, destined to impact the lives of millions and change the intellectual climate of the world. And after that, I had to tell my mom she wasn't allowed to introduce me anymore in public. So thanks for the introduction. It was very nice. I'll try to do it justice. So tonight we are primarily going to talk about science and faith and whether science by itself is enough. But before we do that, I was told that you guys want to hear something about my research. So I'll change screens. And you'll notice I only have 3 slides in this talk, just in case you're worried. Because we academics have a tendency to be able to talk at length on any given subject. So I will keep it brief here. So one of the things that as was said in the introduction, one of the things that I'm really interested in is quantum mechanics and physics and theory and modeling and how those things can be used to understand how electrons move around in molecules and assemblies of molecules. And one of the places this is really, really useful is in describing what are called organic photovoltaics. So a photovoltaic is a little machine for converting sunlight into electricity. And it's one of the emerging technologies that might lessen our dependence on fossil fuels. And when I describe an organic photovoltaic, what I really mean is a photovoltaic that's made out of organic or primarily organic materials. So this, for example, is a 2-layer material, the red material, the blue material, that come together to make a photovoltaic. And then what my job is as a theoretician is to try to explain how something like this works, and therefore for the engineers, how they could make it better. And so in order to do this, I have to blur my eyes out and say, okay, there was a red layer and a blue layer, so it qualitatively looks like this. I'm a theoretician, I need cartoons. So this is my cartoon of the photovoltaic, and the sun is shining on my photovoltaic. And so the first thing, if it's going to convert sunlight into electricity, it needs to absorb the sunlight. So I need to know what part of the spectrum my materials actually absorb. And when the light is absorbed, it creates an excited state called an exciton. And that exciton is going to move around inside of the material. I need to know about diffusion of that exciton. And then I also want to know about the process, the magical process, where that exciton breaks up at the interface and makes 2 charges, because the photovoltaic has to convert the energy into charges, electrical current. And then those 2 charges need to drift out of the materials so that I can collect them. So these are all processes that underpin the way that a photovoltaic would work. They're all microscopic processes that involve molecules and electrons moving around, which are just right in the center of the scientific things I'm interested in. So on an intellectual level, I find all these processes interesting, so we're studying them. But then, of course, we're also interested in this because there's a social impact, a technological impact, because the best thing about organic photovoltaics, okay, the worst thing about them is they're not very efficient yet. So that's where the science is going to be is hopefully going to change things someday. But the one thing that really works about organic photovoltaics is you can make them on a massive scale without much trouble, because the technology for making an organic photovoltaic is the same that they use to print newspapers. And currently there are a lot of idle newspaper printing facilities because newspapers are shutting down. And so we want to seize on that opportunity. So you can print, so this is actually a picture of a company in Massachusetts called Konarka, and that big roll of plastic is a big roll that they can actually print photovoltaics on by just running the rolls through the same way you would print a newspaper. So this both leads to large-scale fabrication, but it also means that you can make really neat, niche solar cells. So down here I've got a movie from one of my colleagues at MIT. The lights are kind of on the screen, aren't they? Let's see. Someone must, okay, so I'll put out there, somebody knows how to control the lights. Let's see. Okay, well, you work on that, and let's try. All right, well, we'll go ahead and go. Wow. Okay, so this is a movie from a colleague of mine at MIT. So I'm a theorist. I don't make any solar cells. What they've done here is they've actually printed an organic solar cell onto a piece of paper. It's actually a piece of tissue paper. And so then I'll play the movie. Oh, there we go. And so here at the bottom, there is the piece of paper that has the solar cell, and you shine light on the paper, and it creates a voltage because there's current flowing out of the solar cell. And then what you're going to see are the hands coming off of the screen. Those are graduate student hands. crumpling up the solar cell. You see it stops working when you crumple it up because it can't absorb the light anymore. And then slowly uncrumpling the paper. And you see that the open circuit voltage recovers after you allow the paper to uncrumple. So you can see, niche applications of this. If you wanted photovoltaic clothes, you could maybe, get something that some piece of fabric that has an organic PV in it. And so, these are the two sort of reasons that people are interested in organic PV. But, so I'm interested in both because I'm interested in the fundamental science. And I'm also interested in the social impact that science can have. So that's my research nugget. Why do I do research and what's interesting about it? But now, today we're going to talk about science. I think this is good, right? It's bright enough that if you fall asleep, I'll still see you. So I think that's perfect. So tonight we're not going to talk just about science, but we're going to talk about whether science is enough. In particular, we're going to talk about science and faith. And when people find out that I'm a chemist and also a Christian, I usually get puzzled looks and questions like, well, doesn't that cause a lot of problems for you? To which my honest answer is, well, no, not really. And when I delve a little bit deeper, usually these questions arise out of some misconception that the asker has about science or faith. Either misperception on the one hand about what science does or does not offer us, or misconception on the other hand about what faith requires of the believer. And so to start off with, I want to talk about some of these misconceptions to get them out of the way so they don't color our discussion at the end, so you can actually listen to us as we start talking about how these things can be integrated. We're not getting back to these common misconceptions. So first things first, we're going to talk about misconceptions about science and misconceptions about faith. And first, we're going to talk about science. So I've got 3 misconceptions to talk about for science. And the first one is the idea that in order to be a good scientist, you will necessarily become an atheist. Okay, now this is an argument that has been championed by folks like Richard Dawkins and Daniel Dennett, the so-called new atheists, or as I like to call them, the evangelical atheists. And their argument goes like this. Being a scientist means that you're going to have a life of repeated application of objective observation of facts. And the process of repeated observation is eventually going to cure you of your misguided notions of faith. So if you're a good scientist, you will eventually become an atheist. Now, like all the misconceptions we're going to discuss tonight, there's a kernel of truth here. And the kernel of truth is that to be a good scientist, you do have to be able to make objective observations. If I go in and collect some data and then analyze it in a biased way, the result, for example, a bias might include things like deleting the data that doesn't agree with the conclusion that I want to draw. The result of that isn't simply bad science, it's not science. To give another example, if I was doing a reaction and I found that I got 125% yield from my reaction, one response I could have to that is, well, God must have suspended the law of conservation of mass in the middle of organic chemistry lab just for me. I deserve an A++ on this. And in that case, my bias, namely my desire to get a good grade in OChem, would have caused me to reject a plausible hypothesis, namely that I had mismeasured the amount of starting material for the reaction, in favor of a less plausible argument. So being a good scientist does require us to be able to do objective observation and testing. Now, the argument goes from there that clearly not believing in God is less biased than believing in God, and therefore, if you're a good scientist, you will eventually become an atheist, QED. But this argument has gone off the rails because atheism is every bit as biased a position as theism is. Science can no more prove the non-existence of God than science can prove the existence of God. So then it would seem that we are stuck. We have 2 positions here, atheism and theism. They're both biased. What do we do? Well, we shouldn't really be surprised by this because scientists have all kinds of biases. Intellectual, social, emotional biases. We bring all kinds of baggage into the lab with us. And the secret to being a good scientist isn't that you have to become some kind of unfeeling, cold, unbiased robot who just performs experiments. The secret to being a good scientist is to learn to recognize your biases and leave them outside of the lab when you come in so that you can perform objective testing. And in this respect, atheism doesn't really provide any particular advantage or disadvantage to being a good scientist. It's just another bias that you have to leave at the door. So that was the first point. The second misconception that I run into a lot is the idea that science is making God irrelevant. So here, the argument goes something like this. In ancient times, we needed God to explain all kinds of things that we couldn't understand, things like thunder and drought and disease. But now we understand how all of those phenomena can be explained in terms of physics and chemistry and biology, and so we find ourselves needing God less and less and less, and eventually we won't need him at all. And this understanding of the interaction of science and faith is known as the God of the gaps understanding of science and faith. And it's also flawed, because the key fallacy at work here is the idea that God can only exist in those phenomena that science cannot explain. That the expansion of scientific knowledge necessarily squeezes God into smaller and smaller boxes. But the truth is that God is not just the God of the gaps, but the God of everything. And that as we learn more and more and more through science, God doesn't get bigger, God doesn't get smaller, he gets bigger, or at least our understanding of God gets bigger. Because Christians believe that God exists not just in things that science can't explain, but also in things that science can explain. You know, for example, I could give you a fact. I could say the fact is that the North Star is actually a collection of 5 astronomical bodies that are 434 light years away from planet Earth. But those facts don't detract from the majesty of a God who created those astronomical bodies and set them into motion. Rather, the facts can add to my wonder at God. And so, it's not true that science is making God irrelevant. To some extent, science makes God even more relevant. So then, the third misconception is the idea that science is the path to certainty. Now, this is going to be an important one for what we discuss later, so I'm going to dwell on it for just a minute. Because, you know, it's natural to think that science leads to certainty, or it's the only way to be really certain about something. After all, science is based on evidence. Things that we can measure and touch and see. And as they say, seeing is believing. And if you hold to this kind of argument, you would typically find people who will characterize faith as just sort of a kind of flimsy guesswork. Something you do when there's not any evidence to go on that doesn't really lead to any kind of certainty at all. Now, there's the kernel of truth here, and the kernel of truth is that, of course, scientific evidence can increase our confidence in a proposition. But confidence is not the same as certainty. As the saying goes, you can tell someone that there are 300 sextillion stars in the universe, and he will believe you. You tell that same person that a bench is covered in wet paint, and he'll need to touch it to be sure. Because confidence is not the same as certainty. Because only in pure mathematics is reason by itself enough to produce absolute certainty. In the natural world, things rarely work out so neatly. You know, if I have a hypothesis, there's typically going to be evidence that supports the hypothesis and evidence that goes against the hypothesis. And as Richard Feynman said, in science, we have found it of paramount importance that in order to progress, we must recognize ignorance and leave room for doubt. Scientific knowledge is a body of statements of varying degrees of certainty. Some most unsure, some nearly sure, but none absolutely certain. Because even for a theory with no known exceptions, in science we must always be wary, because it's always possible that the next bit of data will prove the model wrong. And classical mechanics will give way to quantum mechanics, Newton will give way to Einstein. Because the reality is that science has made great contributions to human knowledge, but not any significant contributions to human certainty. So that's the third misconception that I run into a lot about science, that science leads to certainty. So now let's talk about faith. What are some of the things that some of the misguided notions people have about faith? Well, there's a big one that comes up all the time. And that one is that somehow having faith means you can't believe in fill in the blank. And I've left a blank there for those of you taking notes. You can fill in the blank with your favorite controversial scientific idea, evolution, the Big Bang, dinosaurs, fill in the blank. And this is a really big one. So again, I want to get it on the table first, because there's a general fear that in becoming a Christian or a Muslim or a Jew, one must accept not just God, but also a whole host of other propositions that run counter to scientific evidence. And again, there's a kernel of truth here. And the kernel of truth is that there are any number of questions, historically speaking, where science and the church have been at odds. How old is the universe? What are the origins of species? Does the earth revolve around the sun, or the sun revolve around the earth? And on the Christian side, most of these arguments have arisen out of biblical scriptures. Now, as a Christian, I believe that the Bible is true. I believe that it is free from error. And the Bible does contain a great deal of evidence about God's action in the natural world. But just as scientific evidence requires interpretation to have meaning, so too scriptural evidence requires interpretation to have meaning. Now, what do I mean by interpretation? Let me give you an illustration of what I mean by both of them need interpretation. Let's talk about spontaneous generation. This is the idea that inanimate objects, under the right conditions, can come together to produce life. Okay, so think about if you leave a bowl of cornmeal out on the kitchen counter and maggots form in it. It's a great image. Just hold that in your head. Maggots and cornmeal. Think about that for the rest of the talk. So the dominant scientific explanation of this fact for about 2,000 years was that cornmeal and air come together to spontaneously make maggots. At the same time, early Christian scholars looked at the Bible and said, in the Bible we see examples of things like the Israelites finding quail in the desert, or Samson finding a beehive and the carcass of a lion, and we say, aha, the Bible says spontaneous generation is correct. Science and religion agreed. Unfortunately, they were both wrong. Because in the latter part of the 19th century, Louis Pasteur showed that spontaneous generation is not the normal course of things. So what do we conclude from that? We don't conclude that the original experiments or scripture are wrong. The original experiments were not fabricated. Maggots really do form in cornmeal. If you don't believe me, go home and try it. And Christians continue to believe that the Israelites did find quail in the desert. The evidence was not wrong. The interpretation of the evidence was wrong. Life does not come out of non-life as a matter of course. When that happens, something unusual or even miraculous has occurred. And so Scripture, in this sense, requires interpretation. We have Scripture, we have reason, and we have the opportunity to pray for guidance. And as Christians, we believe that the application of these three things judiciously will lead to truth. And so I can understand from listening to talking heads on the news or reading popular science, popular press, how people might believe that since I'm a Christian, it means that I accepted some universal doctrine of what the Bible teaches about science. But the reality of the situation is that my walk as a Christian is much more one of using prayer and Scripture and, yes, reason to seek after the truth. So being a Christian does not necessarily mean that you can't believe in whatever your favorite controversial theory is. Okay, next misperception about faith. The idea seems to be that faith means ignoring evidence. Here, the idea seems to be that faith means believing things in spite of incontrovertible evidence to the contrary. That people of faith are the kind of people who believe that the Apollo moon landing was fake, while professional wrestling is real. That faith means when you're confronted with evidence that you don't like, you cover your eyes and sing, na 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 boo boo, I can't see you. And this is a characterization of one kind of faith. It's called blind faith. And we meet people who have blind faith all the time. I have a colleague who's an expert in electromagnetic radiation and how it can be used to image. And when the government was ordering the first stealth bombers a number of years back, he was invited down to the Air Force Research Labs to present on his research. And at the end of his talk, he added a few slides just illustrating how terahertz waves could potentially be used to image something like a stealth bomber in flight. He thought the Air Force might be interested in knowing this. And at the end of his talk, a 3-star general in the audience got up and said, "Son, you're mistaken. That plane is invisible." To which my colleague backpedaled a little bit and said, well, of course no one had built such a system, so the planes were safe, but in principle it could be done. To which the general replied in a very ominous tone, "No, son, I said the plane is invisible." Now my colleague managed to not pee his pants. And he thought very quickly, because he realized if he continued along his current line of reasoning, he was liable to wake up with a very bad headache. And so he said, "Oh, yes, sir, of course, it's invisible." Because that is an example of literally blind faith, belief in invisible planes. And this is not the kind of faith that God requires or even desires from us. As Thomas Merton once said, faith is a decision. It is a judgment that is fully and deliberately taken in the light of a truth that cannot be proven. It is not merely the acceptance of a decision that has been made by somebody else. Faith does not give us an excuse to ignore evidence. Christians believe that God left evidence of his action here on earth, and he expects us to examine that evidence. Indeed, much of the Bible was written for precisely this purpose. Thus, the writer of the Gospel of Luke introduces his gospel saying, "It seemed good to me, having followed all things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account for you, that you may have certainty concerning the things that you have been taught." There is all manner of historical evidence for Christianity: the empty tomb, the consistency of the early Christians' testimony, their perseverance under duress. The evidence is not incontrovertible, but it is there if you want to look for it. So that's the second misperception about faith. I could do more, but I don't want to go on and on and on. So now let's get to the real main event, which is, let's talk about the integration of science and faith. Because for these reasons, and a host of other reasons, I think the popular caricature of science and faith as being mutually exclusive is just that. It is a caricature. And so we're left with the question of how can science and faith be integrated? How do they work together? How can they work together? How should they work together? And to organize our discussion of this admittedly broad point, I want to give you one visual aid which illustrates the only three things that I really want to know about in this life. And the three things I would like to know about are the universe, I would like to know about God or gods, if they exist, and I would like to know about me. And I'll note that this figure is not drawn to scale. But science and faith work together to help us understand what these spheres are, what knowledge in these spheres looks like, and how they interact with each other. And so we're going to sort of frame our discussion by having three questions that we want to answer. And the first question is, what is God like, if he or she exists? The second is, how does the universe work? And the third one is, what about me? How do I fit into all of this? And we're going to discuss these questions in turn. So first, let's talk about God. What is God like? Well, obviously, faith has a number of things to say in answer to this question. One could even argue that this is kind of the whole point of faith, to tell us what God is like. But for those who believe that God played a role in the construction of the universe that we live in, natural science also offers a tremendous opportunity for us to learn about God, because natural science is the study of God's handiwork. I would even go so far as to say if you are a natural scientist and also a Christian, you would be hard-pressed not to feel a sense of wonder at the world he has created. Isaac Newton once said, "It is the perfection of God's works that they are all done with the greatest simplicity. He is the God of order and not of confusion." Because while most would say God is beyond comprehension, the universe at least offers a useful lower bound on the complexity and intricacy of God. He's got to be at least as big and grand as the universe he created. And so when I look at how things organize on different levels, from the subatomic weirdness of quantum mechanics to the way that atoms come together to form sophisticated molecules, to the way those molecules cooperate to form life, to the way that life inhabits a galaxy that is a vast galaxy that is in and of itself only one of millions and millions of galaxies in the universe, I get a little bit of a glimpse of what God must be like and how he works. And of course, since we're humans, we're going to understand God the best on our length scale. We're going to understand how he cares about humans and how they behave. But God isn't just a God of people. He's also the God of quarks and the God of quasars too. And so I think that science and faith both have things to teach us about God. So that's the first question. The second question is about the universe how does the universe work? And now this question is the question that's kind of a gimme for science. Of course, science teaches us things about how the universe works. What's not as clear is what role faith plays in this. Some would even argue that this is a question faith should keep its nose out of, because at best, faith is likely to provide simplistic and incorrect models that are going to be embarrassingly disproven by later scientific testing. But this argument assumes there can only be one explanation for a physical phenomenon, and ignores the existence of different layers of meaning. Now let me explain to you what I mean by different layers of meaning by giving you an example. You could ask me a question. You could say, Troy, why is your shirt purple? And I could give you a scientific explanation. I could say, my shirt is purple because there is a high concentration of 6,6-dibromo indigo in the fibers that were used to weave the shirt. And I could even prove that by attempting to remove the dye by chemical treatments and showing you that the shirt turns white. That would be a scientific answer to the question of why my shirt is purple. I could answer the question another way and say, my shirt is purple because my wife thinks I look quite nice in purple. Two different explanations for the same phenomenon, both correct, neither one complete. And the explanations of science and faith for how the universe works exist in exactly this way. For example, you could ask a question, why do bacteria have flagella? And I could give an explanation that says bacteria have flagella because of an evolutionary process. First, the secretory system arose, which led to the development of a protoflagellar filament, which later evolved into the eubacterial flagellum that we know today. I could offer another explanation that says bacteria have flagella because God wanted them to be able to swim. Two different explanations that coexist at different layers of meaning. And this interaction between science and faith in explaining how the natural world works is far from trivial. I gave simple examples to illustrate these things, but it's not trivial because in the scientific exercise, we always go in with one basic assumption. And that basic assumption is that things are the way they are for a reason, that the physical world is going to make sense. But why should we assume that? Albert Einstein once said that the most incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it is comprehensible. And the Christian response to this conundrum is to say that there's a reason for this. The universe was created by a rational, personal deity. And so we can expect that there will be a reason why things are the way they are. There's no observation such that when I ask why, the ultimate answer is going to be why ask why. There's no reason. It's just random chance. And for me, this premise comes to its sharpest point in the area of quantum mechanics, one of the fields that I dearly love. Because the laws of quantum mechanics tell us that there are certain experiments that you can perform where you don't know, you cannot predict the outcome of the experiment until after you've done the experiment itself. You can predict the probability of a given outcome, but you can't tell me what the outcome is actually going to be. And so there are certain scientific questions you could ask me, things like, why did the neutron spin turn out to be up rather than down? And the only scientific explanation I could give for that is, well, there's no reason. It's just random. But the Christian response to that would be to say that in actuality, even this was not random. That though we could not predict the outcome of the experiment in advance, ultimately there is a reason why it turned out the way that it did. Because there's nothing random in a world that is orchestrated by God. So I think that science and faith both have things to teach us about how the universe works, both in terms of overlapping areas of explanation and also places where one of the two runs out. So that's the second question I'd like to answer. Now into the final question. That's enough about me. Let's talk more about me. Because I want to know how I fit into all of this. And this, when I ask the question, is science enough? This is where the question really comes to a point for me. Because I feel that science is really particularly ill-equipped to answer this kind of question. Because the central problem with science is that it never comes up with any kind of truth that is capable of addressing me, the individual. Because the basis for scientific inquiry is the idea that truth is objective. Namely, that truth is an object which exists independent of its observation by the subject, namely me. Therefore, science divorces truth from the truth seeker. So, for example, one of my favorite passages of Scripture is when Jesus tells his disciples, "You shall know the truth, and the truth will set you free." By contrast, the promise of modern science is the somewhat more mundane, "You shall know the truth, and the truth will probably not have any perceptible impact on the way you choose to behave." Because truth is out there, and I am over here. And this is a problem that all of academia actually faces. Let me give you an illustration, a hypothetical. Let's say you took an ethics class in moral rationalism, the idea that right and wrong can be deduced based on rational arguments alone. And in class, you read people like Plato and Kant and Richard Hare. And in class discussions, you show how injunctions like, "It is wrong to lie," and "It is wrong not to share with the needy," can be proven based on rational arguments alone. Okay, now, so you're in the class. Consider two possible final examinations in this class. The first asks you, in one question, to write an essay that uses the principles of moral rationalism to justify the statement, "Truth-telling is always right." I suspect some of you have taken just such a final examination. Now consider an alternative exam, one that also consists of one question. The question says, "During the course of this semester, we proved that it is wrong to lie, and it is wrong not to share what you have with those in need. During the course of the semester, how many times have you lied or failed to share what you have with those in need?" Grading will be as follows: -1 point for every lie, -5 points for every failure to share, and -100 points for lying in response to this question. We can laugh at this because we don't expect the things we learn in class to impact the way we behave, because the truth is out there and we are over here. And this is, to me, one of the fundamental weaknesses of a purely scientific worldview, because it possesses no power to change people. And this is the place where faith becomes crucial in science, turning it from sort of a cold exercise into something that can be vibrant and life-giving. But to see why we need faith to accomplish this, we need to recognize that it is our convictions, the things that we are absolutely certain of, that govern the way we behave. Because if I'm going to organize my life around a principle, I want to be absolutely sure that that principle is true. If I am unsure, I am liable to wait until more evidence comes in. But this never works from a scientific perspective because there's always more evidence I could gather. Scientific evidence can give me greater and greater and greater and greater confidence in something, but it never gets me all the way across the gap from indecision to certainty. The gap that science leaves behind may be a very large gap or a very small gap, but there's always a gap. The last step is always a step of faith. Now, this need not be religious faith. This could be faith in humanity, or faith in the law of gravity, or faith in a person. But there's always needs to be a step of faith. Because faith is the thing that gives us a framework for making decisions in the light of incomplete evidence. Let me give you an example. Suppose I feel there is convincing evidence that human activity is contributing significantly to global warming. Now, this is a hypothetical. I'm not trying to make a case one way or the other about whether this is true, but just suppose I am convinced. But though I am convinced, I still drive an SUV. I still leave incandescent light bulbs on at my house when I am not home. I still fly tens of thousands of miles on vacation every year. In this scenario, I would contend that while I am convinced, I am not certain. Because if I was certain, I would change the way I behave. The fact that I persist in doing things that produce large amounts of CO2 proves one of two things. It either proves that I am not sure that what I am doing actually contributes to global warming, or that I am sure, but I happen to be a fundamentally evil person who does not care about the future of our planet or the security of our country or the well-being of my own children. And so what I need is that kind of certainty, the kind of certainty that is capable of changing the way I behave, because I am not perfect. Now, I know this came as a shock to many of you. I'll give you a chance to assimilate that. I'm not perfect, but up to now, you may have thought that I was. But I'm not perfect, and neither are any of my scientific or religious colleagues. And to my mind, this is the primary argument for a Christian faith over and above any other kind of faith, because the Christian faith provides us not just a framework for making decisions, but also the means to act according to those decisions. And the means is the person of Jesus Christ. Because Christians believe that when I place my faith in Jesus, then the person of Christ comes to live in me. And what I fundamentally believe in is Jesus' ability to change me, to change who I am, to make my life different. And let me explain why that is so important to me. So in junior high and high school, I was a geek. Now I know that was shocking again. You're probably thinking, quantum chemistry professor at MIT, and you were a geek in high school? Get out of town. But it's true, it's true. I was too smart for my own good, I was socially awkward, I was unathletic, and to boot, I grew too quickly. So you can count on it that six months out of the year, my clothes were going to be too small for me. And the unfortunate truth is that chicks don't dig tall, scrawny, awkward dudes who don't know how to dress themselves. And so in the social structure of my high school, there were the cool kids, and then there were kids like me. And I was one of the unpopular kids who desperately wanted to be cool. And it didn't make me a very nice person. You know, I would shun anybody who I perceived as being lower on the social ladder than I was. You know, all the other kids who didn't have enough money to buy all the right clothes, or all the other members of the chemistry Olympiad team who, in my opinion, were far nerdier than I was. And when I got out of high school, things didn't really change. I just replaced popularity with any of a host of other goals: getting good grades, going to the right college, getting the right job, success in my career, making money. Because the problem wasn't with high school or the in crowd or college or academia. The problem is me, the way that I am, the things that I want. And no matter how hard I work, that's not a problem I can solve, because I am the problem. And theistic naturalism doesn't provide me any help here, because if God merely set the universe in motion and set out a sign that says, "Be back in 25 billion years," then I'm stuck. Whatever I am is whatever I am. And unfortunately, most religions are actually even less help on this point, because they tie acceptance by God to our performance, our ability to live by a certain set of rules or accomplish a handful of tasks. Only in Christianity does God provide the means for us to change who we are. The same God who set the universe in motion, who gives breath and life to every living thing, that same God sent to us the means of our redemption in Jesus Christ. Because in Christianity, you don't do good to suck up to God and prove to Him how much better you are than all the non-Christians. In Christianity, morality isn't a ladder that you ascend to draw close to God. In fact, Christianity isn't even the story of people drawing close to God at all. Christianity is the story of God who came down to us and provided the means for our redemption. And for me, this theistic Christian worldview provides the most satisfying way to answer the question, what about me? Where do I fit into the universe? Where do I fit into God's plan for the universe? And so I think we have a lot to talk about, and I'm looking forward to discussion and at least attempting to answer your questions. But before we do question and answer, I just want to share one more story that illustrates the importance of interpretation and layers of meaning in answering questions. There was a girl and her father who went hiking. And when night fell, they made camp and went to sleep. And sometime during the night, the father woke up and looked over and saw his daughter looking up at the stars. And he said, "Sweetie, are you looking up at the stars?" And she said, "Uh-huh." "What does that tell you, Dad?" And the dad was very excited. "Well, sweetie, the stars tell me that there are billions and billions of astronomical bodies in the universe, all obeying the same law of gravitation." "Uh-huh." The dad was a bit crestfallen that she was not more impressed. So he tried again and said, "Well, by looking at that constellation of stars and the inclination it makes with the horizon, I can tell that it's about 3:30 in the morning." The daughter said, "Uh-huh." Dad was really starting to lose steam at this point, so he tried one more time, and he said, "Well, noting the order of the universe, it tells me that a majestic God created and tuned the universe specifically for the creation of life. He made an entire universe, in short, so that you and I could live in it." The daughter was still not impressed and said, "Dad, do you know what it tells me? It tells me somebody stole our tent." Thank you very much. Safari's already open. There we go. You're good? All right.
We're just loading up the questions right now. We also have a microphone that we can run to anyone who has questions. So if you still are thinking of questions, we'll bring the mic out if you raise your hand.
Thank you very much. It was a really nice talk.
Thanks.
Okay, so I just wanted to say that, well, like you said so many like positive things about Christianity, but well, when we look at history, we see the Dark Ages, right? And with the same name, so many horrible things happen. So, you know, it's not that Christianity is perfect.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I certainly, yeah, okay.
And also in the three circles you draw, I didn't see anything about the society we live in. Isn't that also part of the question? Because again, referring back to the previous thing, this society and religion, especially when they get mixed up, they create all these, you know, authoritarian regimes and all of the Middle Ages and what's happening right now, you know, all these bad things. It's all a mixture of society and religion. And it happens to all religions. It's not just, yeah. So, and finally, I just wanted to say that, well, it seems that, well, a scientist's view, like, would be a critical scientist to religion. Not all scientists. It would just be that, as Laplace said to Napoleon, that why would I need the assumption of God if I can explain everything without it? So yeah, this is just my comment. Sorry.
Yeah, okay. So I'll briefly touch on the first point and the last point. So I think certainly there are bad things that the church has done in the history of the world, unquestionably. There are also a lot of good things that the church has done in the history of the world. And now whether on balance there are more bad things than good things, who knows? But it's certainly not. I certainly would never make the case that Christians are perfect or the paragons of virtue or have never done anything wrong. That's that would certainly, I think there would be a false on the face of it statement. In terms of whether the church has always, whether the church has veered into being, more evil than good at times in history, is really more of a question of, the people involved. Were those people really, questioning in their motives and their biases and what they were doing? And the answer is no. We screw things up all the time. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're not trying to go in the right direction. So, and then as far as whether Laplace's point, that I have no need of this hypothesis, the hypothesis of God, that works insofar as the only thing that you want is sort of a one-dimensional definition of truth, which is a mechanistic, this caused this, if I change this, this changes this, changes this.
I would say just the assumption of truth, not God. Why should there be a truth? Science has proved that there is no truth. I mean, it's 2,000 years that we're just proving ourselves wrong. I mean, in 200 years, technology is going to advance so much that everything, the basis of everything we know, not the technology.
Yeah, I would actually say that science doesn't say there is no truth. I would give a much more positive spin on the interaction between science and truth, and that science has done, I think, a very great thing, and that science has, every scientist I know has a view of that truth is objective, that there is a truth to be pursued. Well, that's what I'm saying. Is this is certainly the scientific point of view. I would say that there are very few practicing scientists who would agree with the statement there is no truth. No. I would say that most scientists, whether or not they've thought deeply about it, live as if they believe there is an objective truth. That is certainly the way that most scientists operate. We believe that we do the experiments and that it's pursuing an objective truth that is to be found, that it's not some subjective truth that's going to escape us later on. So I would say that whether or not that's integral to science, whether you could do science thinking that there is no objective truth, perhaps, but procedurally, I would say that most scientists actually do think there's objective truth.
Okay, we'll transition to some of the questions on the computer briefly. One of the questions that's come in, there have been a lot of questions on evolution, and asking Troy, how do you reconcile evolution with your Christian faith?
Right. So I will say from the outset that there's a whole range of different questions that fall, different ways that you can answer that kind of question. I will say that some of you are going to be disappointed by the answer I'm about to give, because I'm not going to advocate for any of the political camps that exist in the creation, evolution, intelligent design. There are a huge range of different points of view, even amongst believing Christians, in terms of evolution, creationism, intelligent design. How do those things all fit together? All the way from folks who think that the Bible is completely literally true and therefore the earth is 6,000 years old, to people who believe all of the scientific evidence is true and that any biblical passage that has to do with the natural world should be interpreted figuratively. And there's everything in between. Now, so first of all, in terms of how one reconciles those things, there is a whole range of how different people come to grips with reconciling those things. The thing that I want to encourage all of you, though, is to recognize that both people who agree with your viewpoint, because there's very few people who are undecided on this, I find. Almost everyone is already decided. They know what they think. And they want somebody who's going to, it's kind of like politics, like you know who you're going to vote for, and you want to hear people who say, oh yeah, this person's great. I want everyone to recognize that, both for your own position and for other people's positions, these need to be based on honest grappling with the scriptural evidence and the scientific evidence, and any other form of evidence that you feel is appropriate, in order to say, all right, this is why I think this is right. And to appreciate that in some cases, it may be that people in the opposing camp also have evidence and have also thought through their arguments. They're not just evil or stupid or whatever. Because I think that there is an objective truth on this. Probably, if you say, then you could say narrowly define it, you get it way, way down there. The important thing, though, is to recognize that there are these hosts of different viewpoints, and we have to figure out how we can converse about these things in a way that actually is pursuing truth rather than just trying to beat someone over the head to agree with you. And so I don't feel like my position up here, it's worthwhile for me to say, this is my opinion, come rally around me. I think that actually sets the debate back, because this is not a fair debate, because I'm the only one who gets to talk. So if you want to debate these things, you have to debate them in groups of 2 people or 3 people or 4 people where you can actually hear each other out. So that's why I will punt and not say, here is my interpretation of the following things about evolution and creation. But if you want to come up with 1 or 2 people, then we can talk about it.
As a brief follow-up, for anyone who's interested, do you have any resources you could recommend for someone who's interested in exploring this question?
Let's see. That's a very good question. I should have an answer for it just right there, but I don't. So I don't have a resource, but probably if you email me, I would. Just I need more time to think about it and a little bit of reminding myself about books that I've read as to which ones I would actually recommend.
We'll take another question from the text. This one I think is interesting. Should science have any role in determining morality?
Should science have any role in determining morality? I think yes, because certainly there are times where we do not know the consequences of our action until scientific evidence actually says, actually what you're doing is this. And once we have the scientific evidence, I think that we have every right to say, yes, this should impact our morality. Now, you say, well, how much is that going to impact our morality? Well, there are certain things that I don't think there's, like, you shouldn't kill. I don't think there's any scientific evidence to say, oh no, actually you should kill, it's really good. So, I mean, there are certain boundaries where it's like, okay, this isn't going to change, there's no scientific evidence that's going to change this particular moral point. But there are things that we do where, it's, the finer details of things like global warming, for example, if, as an example of where scientific evidence would impact, if we find out either carbon dioxide doesn't make global warming happen, then that would impact the moral decision because there would no longer be moral dimension about gas guzzling. Or if we find out that it really does, then there is a moral dimension to that. And the evidence then does impact, I think, our moral decision.
Okay, also, feel free to raise your hand if you have questions, so we'll jump to you. Okay, first question here.
I guess being a physicist, it seems like even though the world itself is incredibly complicated, the core ideas, like the core laws, are actually incredibly simple.
Mm-hmm.
But studying a lot of the theological structure of Christianity, it just seems like there's so many aspects, so many arguments, and it's very chaotic. Like, why did God, like, there are so many different things. Why did Jesus come 2,000 years ago in this place? Why are there angels and demons and hell and blah, blah, blah? So, like, how do you...
Yeah, I don't like reading theology either. But I think some of the difficulty there is one of culture. That in the social sciences, argument and nuance are much, much, much more appreciated and desired than they are in physics. You know, even some physicists like things are really complicated. But when I was in physics classes, I liked the simplicity of it. Like, oh, it really boils down to like the Schrodinger equation or the Dirac equation. That's great. And so in that respect, I think that something, you know, when you say, oh, well, you know, you read theology and it doesn't appeal to you, I think it would probably be the same thing if you read like a sociology article or, you know, some abstract economics article. Like, I feel the same way when I'm reading those things. I'm like, wow, this is just really not how I think about the world. Doesn't mean it's not true. Doesn't mean that all of sociology is false just because I don't like reading sociology articles. It just means you know, this is one of those things where there's so much diversity amongst people. You know, we kind of have, you know, we can put the blinders on and say, God is only the piece of God that I understand. Or he's only the way that I appreciate him being. And that, I think, can't really be true because there's such a diversity of people. You know, it says, you know, well, then everybody to understand God would have to be uniform. We would all have to like the same things and look at things the same way, and that's not true. And so certainly when you look at some of these, you know, theological discussions, I was actually having a discussion just a few days ago about angels and demons, and I was just like, dude, I don't know. You know, I don't really know a lot about angels and demons and their theology, and it doesn't affect my day-to-day life, so I just sort of punt on it. Yeah. Hi. Mm-hmm.
All the time. And is it possible that by taking that last step of faith, we are limiting ourselves?
Yeah, so I would maybe even, you know, your very first statement of, I don't remember what you were, I would agree with your first statement. Certainty is dangerous. It is very dangerous. You know, because if you're certain about the wrong thing and you're really certain of it, you can cause a lot of damage. So I don't throw it around lightly and say, oh, everybody wants to be certain and then we'll be happy and get along. You know, certainty is a very dangerous thing. Unfortunately, it's the least dangerous thing that we have because the opposite of certainty is inaction. So in my use of the word certainty, because when I would talk about, so the Christian idea of certainty is the idea that certainty is not the absence of doubt. So I have doubts all the time about Christianity, but I would still say that I am certain of it. Not because I have the absence of doubts, but because I have the confidence and the certainty to act, as you said, as if it is true. So that is certainty under the sort of Christian definition of things, because you know there's lots of examples of folks in the Bible having doubts, disciples and so forth. And it doesn't mean that they didn't believe, they just also had doubts coexisting with belief. And the deciding factor in, according to Christianity is not, well, how many doubts did you have? Were you 99% certain, 98? All of the measures are based on decisions. The decision to act according to or as if you believe something. And there is actually a sense in Christianity in which acting according to the belief reinforces your certainty of it. That certainty is actually an active process, not a passive process. Not something you just wait and wait and wait and then you receive certainty, but that it's tested through action. So when you say in science, you have this idea that, well, we're not 100% sure, but we're going to go assuming that it is true, but open to the possibility that it might be wrong. I'd say that's still consistent with certainty in the way that Christianity would define it. Does that make sense?
So as just an interesting side note, that's actually the end result of the philosophy of science where we're currently at is you can't be certain of anything, but by acting on something, you can see whether or not your assumption came out to be true or not. And so I did this thing, and yes, what I expected happened, so I can understand or I can expect with a certain higher degree of probability that yes, it is true, but there's never 100%.
Yeah, and that aspect of science actually grew out of the fact that science in the early days was founded by a lot of people who were actually Christian. So they went in with this same kind of assumption about faith and truth, and they guessed, well, if I do this in science, then it will also work. And it turned out that it did, and now people try to say, well, you could have done it without Christianity. That's true, but that particular aspect of the Christian worldview was important for the development of science.
Okay, so first let me comment on the previous questions that theology is very complex. I think if we go to the Bible, the teaching of Jesus is really simple. And this brings me to my question to your talk. So you showed this nice integration.
Yeah.
But Jesus doesn't say anything about integrating science, research with religion or with faith. Instead, he chooses the simplest people, and he tells us that our faith should be like the faith of a child. So does it make sense at all trying to combine these two things?
Yeah. So I would say that's even a little bit more dire a situation than that. So if there are two groups that Jesus, or that the New Testament has bad things to say about, it's rich people and smart people. Those are the two people that consistently get just blasted, are those two classes of people. So that should make somebody like me pretty uncomfortable. Especially when I look at my paycheck from MIT and I think, oh, geez. But the point about this, but if you really, so I've actually wrestled with that for a long time. I'm like, I'm not really, if I looked at the socioeconomic status of the people that Jesus really favored, I'm not really favored. And it's true that, there is a lot in the Gospels that gets back to the fact that you don't have, it's using in some cases hyperbole of saying, look, you don't have to be super, super smart to be a Christian. When you get down to it, the basics are simple. But if there is some layer of complexity that you have in terms of your worldview and understanding, it's not as if Christianity is incapable of engaging that it's just beyond you, beyond Christianity. You're so smart that you're smarter than God. And so those layers of complexity are there. It's not necessary to understand them. If you don't want to, you don't have to. I'm sort of preaching to the choir here at Caltech because I figure you're like at MIT, where you really want to know these things. This is really what you want to do. You're going to do it. And so then how do you take the things that you want to do and actually integrate them with something else that you feel like is important? But it's certainly not necessary. If you say, I don't really care about this science stuff, I'm just going to go grow corn, you're allowed to do that.
It's not really about not caring about science stuff, but it's literally taking the gospel and seeing Jesus taking a child as an example and telling the disciples that the faith should really be like the faith of this child. So it's not really not wanting to understand more.
Oh, okay. So, maybe we should clarify what we interpret from that passage. I don't want to spend too long on one question, but there's a modern Western interpretation of that passage based on what we think of children being like, because the Victorian era changed the way children were considered. So in the Victorian era, childhood became this idyllic time, this time of innocence, joy, happiness, time to be protected and sheltered, all of these things. Children were so valuable. During Jesus' time, children were not considered in this way. Children were considered as almost the same status as slaves. They were second-class citizens. And so saying you should have faith like this child was an insult. It was saying you should have faith like someone who's like almost subhuman. You should not consider yourself as having some huge, great faith, but think of yourself like a child. In the same way that he says, you know, the rich people, they all suck. You know, all those really smart people, they're going to be shamed by the wisdom of God. It was that is, at least in my reading of the passage, when he says you should have the faith of a child, is you should have the same kind of faith that someone who's not very respected in the world would have. So that was why I answered the question as I was answering. Just so that you know I was actually listening. But your interpretation, I mean, that's my interpretation of it, but your interpretation is also, you know, it's Bible requires interpretation, so you know I might be wrong.
Okay, we're going to move to a question from text, and we'll take maybe one or two more questions after that. This question, I think, is a very good question. Why couldn't a person take responsibility to change their own behavior? Why rely on Jesus to change your behavior?
Yeah, so this is a very good question. I've definitely met atheists and humanists and agnostics who take this responsibility on themselves. It's certainly possible. You know, you can certainly say, look, I am going to, by the force of my own will, pull myself up by my own bootstraps and figure out how to live a moral life. The problem, as I see it, is what if you don't want to? Or what if you don't have quite enough energy? What if you're kind of tired that day? What if, you know, you feel kind of lazy? You know, there are all kinds of excuses that we can throw up about why we don't really want to do what is right. And to me, this is a big problem because there's a lot of times where I don't feel like doing it. And the whole point of Christianity is that there's this process of transformation that is supernatural. It doesn't rely on my own strength, but relies on the strength of God. And if we're going to have something that's universal, that applies to everybody, not just to the people who are have really, really strong wills and really, really good self-control, but is going to apply to even to people who have weak self-control and weak wills, it has to be something that offers them help, assistance in transforming into the person that they really ought to be. And so my examples are not to imply that there can't be, say, moral atheists who are moral, and it's not to imply that there's nothing that we can do to motivate ourselves to make good decisions, just that because of our own limitations, there's always a limited degree to which I can make myself do what is right, based on who I am and what I've got.
You spoke of evidence and faith that could employ evidence, and what I'm wondering is, this might be a little personal, so feel free to decline, but I'd like to hear some examples of evidence that have shaken your faith. Essentially, I'm looking for evidence that sways you both ways initially, even though you're going to finally probably conclude something, as you were saying, you like to have confidence that you can act. So I'm just curious of some examples.
So, you know, okay, what's the one thing that shakes my faith or makes me question my faith the most? I'll say is there life after death? Because Christianity certainly gives an answer to that yes, there is life after death, and it's going to be great, according to, you know, whatever vague account there is in the Bible. But, you know, that certainly seems almost too good to be true, doesn't it? You know, because if you look at just sort of the physical world evidence, it seems like you die, you don't get up. That's it. And, you know, when I was a child, I was very afraid. I remember when I was 6, I watched a special on National Geographic about how the sun was going to go supernova in like 5 billion years, and I got very, very upset. Because at that time, I was like, well, even if I live that long, how am I going to survive that? And it just hit me, I'm going to die someday. And so I was a kind of a morbid child. So when I think about it, I think, gee, this certainly sounds too good to be true. What if there's nothing after death? If there is, I'll be very disappointed. But what if there's nothing? So that's something that makes me, you know, if I wake up at 3 a.m. and I'm anxious about something, it's likely to be that. But the thing that I always come back to is that as humans, we have these notions of things like justice and rightness and hope for the future, and the way things ought to be. And those are things that don't exist here in this world. They come from somewhere else. And so when I think about it, I think, you know, there's got to be something more than this. I'm pretty confident of that. That, you know, in my experience, I believe there's a God. You know, I sometimes question whether there's, you know, something after death, but I believe there's a God, and I believe there is something more than this universe. And so I believe that there's more than this life, and so, but that's based on my experience of God and, you know, my experience of life, and so I think there must be more, and therefore I think there's probably a way that human beings participate in that something more. And so I end up saying, okay, well fine, I find the proposition of heaven by itself very hard to believe, but I will believe in it because of other propositions related to faith that I do believe. Which I think is important, because I think some people think Christians, like, are Christians because of heaven. Like, you know, well, that sounds really good, so I'll sign up. But for me, at least, it's the opposite. You know, I don't believe in God because I want to go to heaven. I want to go to heaven because I believe in God, and I know what He's like. And that's, you know, apparently the end of where we get to meet Him. So.
Last question.
Hi, Troy. Thanks for coming. It sounds like you're deciding truth about God and the universe based on what's useful or gives you purpose.
Okay. Are you saying, is that true? Is that the question you want to ask? Okay, I just wasn't sure if there was... Okay, so the question is that true? What's useful or gives me purpose? I'm not sure that... I wouldn't necessarily disagree with that statement, but I'm not sure I would agree. I mean, I would say it's like, you know, if I was to try to say how I decide what's true about God, it's not that it's like orthogonal to that or parallel to that, but, you know, there may be skew from each other, or, you know, different hyperplanes. Because certainly I don't necessarily decide what I believe is true based on what is useful to me. You know, the things that I wrestle the most with are the things that will be useful to me, because, you know, I keep getting confronted by, you know, well, should I really give money to the guy on the street, or should I really, you know, say this to this person? You know, those are things that are useful to me, so I wrestle with them a lot. There are other things that are not as useful to me, so I don't wrestle with them. But I don't know that, you know, because I think deciding what is true based on utility is a very dangerous proposition, because there can be things that are useful and convenient that are completely wrong. And so I would be nervous using that as sort of my metric for truth. In terms of purpose, I'm not sure of the cause and effect there. Certainly the things that I believe are true about God do give me purpose. And so I think there can be a way in which there's a feedback loop, where you say, okay, well, if I'm deciding between two truth propositions, and one truth proposition would lead to this purpose for my life, and this one would lead to this purpose, then I can ask, well, which one of those seems more likely to be the purpose for my life? But that is an ingredient, but I wouldn't say it's the sole ingredient. There are some times, certainly, where I wrestle with truth propositions, because I'll be honest, I didn't think that God's plan for my life was for me to be a professor at MIT. So, you know, if you'd asked me, you know, I would have taken a look at some of those passages about how God doesn't like rich people and doesn't like smart people, and say, aha, see, God doesn't want me to be a professor at MIT. But it turns out that's what He wanted, and so that's where I went. So in the end, I think that there is some feedback there, but I wouldn't necessarily say that purpose is causal in terms of deciding truth. Did I answer your question at all, or was I completely off base? Okay, you can come talk to me afterwards, and I'll try to answer it better. So.
Okay, thank you everyone for your questions. Let's all thank Troy once again.
For more information about the Veritas Forum, including additional recordings and a calendar of upcoming events, please visit our website at veritas.org.